60 minutes ago, Japan made a decision that mainstream media will frame as procedural, diplomatic, perhaps even mundane. Yet if you're connected to America's automotive sector, or your pension depends on it, or your community relies on factory jobs, this move should feel like a gut punch. Japan has essentially declared that regarding the future of vehicles, battery technology, and sustainable industrial supply networks, it places greater confidence in Canada than America. And this revelation should give us pause, because we're not discussing national ego or an isolated trade arrangement. We're examining how dangerously close America is sliding toward an industrial precipice that could eliminate hundreds of billions in production, capital deployment, and compensation if we continue pretending that strategic disorder equals a plan. Here's what formally occurred. Without the political spin, Japan, among the world's most advanced manufacturing powerhouses and a cornerstone of global automotive supply networks, decided to strengthen its strategic partnership with Canada around crucial automotive and renewable energy components, bypassing the United States. Canada represents lasting commitments surrounding procurement, investment frameworks, and supply reliability. These represent the calculations corporations and nations make when determining where to construct next-generation facilities, where to secure battery resources, and where they anticipate policy remaining rational 10 or 20 years forward. And Japan just communicated to us courteously yet unmistakably that it doesn't perceive America as the more secure option. To grasp why this carries weight, you must step back from the announcement and examine our current moment. The worldwide automotive sector isn't merely producing vehicles anymore. It's reconstructing itself fundamentally around electric powertrains, battery systems, digital architecture, and extensive public-private collaboration. This isn't some free market fantasy. Every major auto economy practices industrial policy today, whether acknowledged or not. China executes it openly, Europe implements it cautiously but intentionally, Japan pursues it methodically with nearly obsessive attention to extended stability, and Canada quietly has positioned itself as the responsible actor. Consistent regulations, harmonized environmental objectives, reliable trade commitments, and industrial strategy that doesn't fluctuate dramatically with each electoral cycle. Conversely, America has been transmitting confused, occasionally self-destructive messages. Theoretically, we possess ambitious industrial strategy. The Inflation Reduction Act and associated provisions promise incentives, domestic sourcing requirements, and a manufacturing rebirth. But overlaid onto this is persistent political instability, warnings to abandon trade pacts, open discussion of universal tariffs, judicial challenges seeking to dismantle central climate initiatives, entire segments of industrial planning treated as political prizes rather than national obligations. If you're a Japanese manufacturer or supplier considering where to establish a $40 billion investment lasting decades, you don't merely examine this year's tax advantages. You pose a far more troubling question. Will this nation still welcome us when political currents reverse? This is where the economics becomes uncomfortable for American optimists. Industrial networks are path-dependent. Once supply systems begin concentrating elsewhere, they're extraordinarily difficult to retrieve. Battery factories attract component manufacturers. Component manufacturers attract distribution centers. Distribution centers attract trained workforce. And once that beneficial cycle accelerates north across the border, America's automotive sector doesn't simply forfeit several factories. It risks surrendering the gravitational force that has sustained an entire manufacturing ecosystem for generations. That's what analysts reference when discussing a $300 billion catastrophe. Not one immediate transaction, but a gradual hemorrhaging of investment, advancement, and negotiating strength that multiplies annually. And the painful paradox is this was preventable. America possesses the market scale, technical expertise, financial resources, and consumer demand to dominate the next automotive epoch. What we've been missing is trustworthiness, not trustworthiness with constituents, but trustworthiness with entities and organizations making extended economic calculations. Japan's pivot toward Canada represents a logical reaction to incentives and exposure. It's not an affront, it's a cautionary signal. And if we persist treating industrial strategy as a cultural warfare tool instead of what it genuinely is, a sustained commitment to collective prosperity, we shouldn't express surprise when our closest partners I'll readapt this script for you, maintaining the same structure and approximate length while reframing the language. 60 minutes back, Japan made a decision that mainstream media outlets will frame as procedural, diplomatic, perhaps even mundane. But if your livelihood touches the American automotive sector, or if your pension portfolio does, or if your community still relies on industrial employment, this move should register like a physical blow. Japan has essentially indicated that regarding the automotive future, battery technology, and sustainable industrial supply networks, it places greater confidence in Canada than in America. And that ought to freeze us in our tracks because this transcends national ego or an isolated commercial agreement. It concerns how dangerously close America is sliding toward an industrial precipice that could eliminate hundreds of billions in economic output, capital deployment, and compensation if we continue pretending that strategic inconsistency constitutes a plan. Here's the official account. Beneath the political messaging, Japan, among the world's most advanced manufacturing powers and a cornerstone of global automotive supply networks, has chosen to strengthen its strategic partnership with Canada concerning critical automotive and sustainable energy components, bypassing the United States. Canada translates to extended commitments involving procurement, investment frameworks, and supply security. These represent the decisions corporations and nations execute when determining where to construct next-generation facilities, where to secure battery resources, and where they anticipate regulatory environments will remain rational across decades. And Japan just communicated to us, diplomatically yet unmistakably, that it doesn't perceive America as the more secure choice. To grasp the significance, you must step back from the immediate news and examine our current moment. The worldwide auto sector isn't merely producing vehicles anymore. It's reconstructing itself fundamentally around electric powertrains, batteries, digital systems, and extensive public-private integration. This isn't some free market fantasy. Every significant automotive economy now practices industrial strategy, whether acknowledged or not. China implements it transparently. Europe approaches it cautiously, yet intentionally. Japan executes it systematically with nearly obsessive attention to extended stability. And Canada has quietly established itself as the responsible actor. Consistent regulations, synchronized environmental objectives, reliable commercial commitments, and industrial strategy that doesn't fluctuate dramatically between electoral cycles. Conversely, America has been transmitting contradictory, occasionally counterproductive signals. Theoretically, we possess ambitious industrial strategy. The Inflation Reduction Act and associated initiatives promise incentives, domestic sourcing requirements, and a manufacturing resurgence. But overlaying this is persistent political turbulence, warnings to dismantle commercial agreements, open discussion of comprehensive tariffs, judicial challenges aimed at core environmental policy, substantial portions of industrial strategy weaponized as partisan prizes rather than national obligations. If you're a Japanese automaker or component manufacturer determining where to establish a $40 billion investment spanning decades, you don't merely examine this year's tax advantages. You pose a far more unsettling question. Will this nation still welcome us when political currents reverse? This is where economics becomes uncomfortable for American optimists. Industrial networks are path dependent. Once supply chains begin concentrating elsewhere, they're extraordinarily difficult to reclaim. Battery facilities attract component suppliers attract distribution centers attract trained workforce. And once that positive cycle activates north of the frontier, the American automotive sector doesn't simply forfeit several factories, it risks losing the gravitational force that has sustained an entire manufacturing network across generations. That's what analysts reference when discussing a $300 billion catastrophe. Not a singular immediate expenditure, but a gradual hemorrhage of capital, innovation, and negotiating leverage, compounding annually. And the painful paradox is this was preventable. America possesses the market scale, technical expertise, financial resources, and consumer demand to dominate the next automotive epoch. What we've been missing is reliability, not reliability with constituents, but reliability with entities and institutions executing long-range economic choices. Japan's orientation toward Canada represents a calculated response to incentives and exposure. It's not an affront, it's an alert. And if we persist treating industrial strategy as a cultural battleground instead of what it genuinely represents, a sustained commitment to collective prosperity, we shouldn't register surprise when our closest partners quietly begin constructing the future without American participation. Now, certain observers will hear this and respond, "You're catastrophizing." This is merely diversification. Japan can collaborate with Canada and America simultaneously. And yes, superficially, supply networks aren't zero-sum, but that reaction overlooks how these determinations actually function practically. When a government like Japan's executes a strategic selection, it's not hedging casually. It's prioritizing partners by dependability. It's deciding where it anticipates policy exposure is reduced, where regulatory structures will persist across years, and where political figures are less inclined to destroy the entire framework for immediate domestic approval. In that hierarchy, America just descended, and that should concern anyone who still assumes American industrial supremacy is guaranteed. The fundamental issue here is America has been broadcasting conflicting signals regarding what kind of economic participant it intends to become. On one side, we declare we desire resilient supply networks, quality manufacturing employment, and dominance in sustainable technology. On the opposite side, we openly flirt with protectionism that's more theatrical than strategic. We intimidate partners with tariffs as though they're adversaries. We regard commercial agreements as expendable, and we permit significant industrial strategy to be portrayed not as a national endeavor, but as partisan patronage that can be withdrawn if opposing factions secure the subsequent election. From an economic viewpoint, that's toxic. Capital abhors uncertainty more intensely than taxation. And presently, uncertainty is the singular commodity America exports abundantly. Japan comprehends this better than virtually anyone. Its own post-war economic achievement was constructed on integration, not disorder. Extended planning, stable projections, mutual comprehension between government and enterprise regarding national direction, even when expansion decelerated or politics became turbulent. So when Japanese strategists examine abroad for collaborators in the subsequent phase of industrial evolution, they're not simply asking who provides the largest immediate incentive. They're asking who will still fulfill the commitment when it ceases being politically expedient. Canada, despite its limitations, has been remarkably steady on that dimension. Its environmental policy, industrial incentives, and commercial stance align consistently. America doesn't, at least not dependably. This is where the automotive sector returns to prominence. Contemporary vehicles are no longer simply assembled products. They're platforms constructed on intricate, capital-intensive supply networks. Batteries alone encompass mining, processing, chemistry, production, and recovery, all demanding extended planning periods and regulatory predictability. If those networks begin establishing themselves in Canada-Japan corridors, America doesn't merely forfeit manufacturing sites, it forfeits influence. It forfeits the capacity to establish standards. It forfeits negotiating authority over compensation and technology transfers. And once that authority vanishes, reconstructing it is devastatingly expensive, if achievable whatsoever. What renders this moment particularly exasperating is American policymakers recognize this. The discourse about supply network resilience didn't emerge spontaneously. It derived from difficult lessons throughout the pandemic when facilities ceased operation because one absent component was stranded globally. It originated from a growing recognition that laissez-faire globalization left critical sectors dangerously vulnerable. But instead of securing a sustainable, pragmatic, mature structure for industrial cooperation with partners, we superimposed that understanding onto a political atmosphere obsessed with spectacle. Tariffs become applause generators. Commercial threats become fundraising mechanisms, and partners learn rationally to explore alternatives. There's also a distributional dimension rarely reaching headlines. When capital flows toward Canada instead of America, the losses aren't uniformly distributed. They impact most severely precisely the regions politicians claim to champion. Midwestern industrial communities, southern automotive belts, localities promised revival through electrification and reindustrialization. Those positions don't vanish because of abstract market dynamics. They disappear because policy signals informed investors that America might not represent a secure location for extended commitments. That's not globalization malfunctioning. That's domestic political failure with international ramifications. So when you learn about Japan selecting Canada, don't categorize it as a minor diplomatic footnote. Recognize it for reality. A stress test America just failed, not because we lack capability, but because we lack credibility. And unless that transforms, this won't be the final instance a partner quietly determines that constructing the future elsewhere represents the wiser decision. At this juncture, it's tempting to transform this into a morality narrative about free commerce versus protectionism, but that framework misses the genuine lesson. The nations succeeding in the subsequent phase of industrial transformation aren't the most ideological, they're the most coherent. They synchronize commercial policy, environmental policy, labor frameworks, and industrial incentives into a singular, comprehensible narrative about economic direction. That coherence reduces exposure, and reduced exposure attracts capital. America, conversely, has been alternating between ambitious schemes and self-generated uncertainty. And investors perform calculations. They incorporate that assessment. Consider how an automotive executive or battery supplier actually evaluates this landscape. They're not questioning whether America or Canada is more capitalist. They're questioning where regulations will be clearer, where incentives won't be revoked mid-process, and where cross-border commerce won't suddenly be reinterpreted as a challenge to national dignity. They're questioning whether a facility constructed today will still qualify for benefits following the subsequent election, or whether it'll become a political target. When those questions arise, even substantial American incentives begin resembling a wager rather than a certainty. The economic mechanism here is devastatingly straightforward. Industrial capital is concentrated, irreversible, and extended. Once you establish infrastructure, develop workforce, and construct supplier networks, you cannot simply relocate because policy shifted. That means corporations demand a premium for uncertainty. If that premium escalates excessively, they relocate elsewhere. Canada, by providing a narrower yet more stable commitment set, can outperform a larger yet more volatile American market on a risk-adjusted foundation. That's not ideological, it's fundamental finance. There's also a misconception we must dispel that America can always force its return later. History suggests otherwise. Examine consumer electronics, examine solar production, examine shipbuilding. Once networks relocate, they generate their own inertia. Expertise clusters, innovation tracks production. Political influence gravitates toward locations where employment already exists. By the time policymakers awaken and determine action is necessary, the intervention cost has multiplied. The notion that the American auto sector is protected from this dynamic because of size or historical significance isn't confidence, it's complacency. What Japan's move genuinely exposes is how partners interpret American unpredictability. They don't perceive it as resolve, they perceive it as interference. And interference is lethal in systems requiring coordination across boundaries, corporations, and decades. Japan isn't abandoning America from animosity. It's quietly constructing redundancy. It's ensuring that if American politics swerves in a direction undermining environmental policy, commercial stability, or industrial incentives, its corporations won't be stranded. Canada provides that protection. America presently doesn't. And here's the uncomfortable political economy reality. This instability isn't accidental. It's the consequence of incentives rewarding immediate signaling over sustained outcomes. Politicians receive applause for threatening tariffs, not for patiently sustaining commercial frameworks. Media cycles reward confrontation, not consistency. Even industrial strategy gets marketed as a weapon against opponents rather than shared investment in national capacity. The outcome is a nation desiring industrial strategy benefits without accepting the political expense of mundane, durable governance. For workers, this manifests as cruel deception. They're informed that electrification will restore employment, that facilities will emerge again, that the future will be constructed in their communities. But those commitments depend on something less spectacular than rhetoric, trust. trust from investors that regulations will endure, trust from partners that cooperation won't be penalized, trust from workers that today's positions won't vanish with tomorrow's political shift. When Japan selects Canada, it's casting judgment on that trust, and America just lost a round. If this sounds theoretical, it shouldn't. The automotive sector sits at the convergence of environmental policy, commerce, labor, and national security. Losing position here isn't merely an economic setback, it's a strategic one. It signifies diminished control over critical technologies, weaker negotiating authority in future discussions, and fewer instruments to influence a transition that's already disruptive. And all of that flows from a singular, solvable problem. America hasn't determined whether it desires to be a dependable partner or a perpetual uncertainty. What renders this even more concerning is the expenses of being uncertain don't materialize immediately. They accumulate quietly, almost imperceptibly, until suddenly they're omnipresent. A facility that never gets announced, a supplier that chooses expansion north instead of south, a research collaboration that gets established in Toronto rather than Detroit. None of these moments register as crisis individually, but collectively they establish a pattern, and patterns drive long-range economic trajectories. By the time politicians begin discussing a manufacturing emergency, the decisions that generated it are already years past. There's also a tendency in American debates to regard partners as interchangeable, as if capital and cooperation will perpetually default to America because of scale. That assumption is increasingly obsolete. Canada offers something America presently struggles to deliver: alignment. Its commercial commitments, environmental objectives, and industrial incentives reinforce rather than conflict with each other. For a nation like Japan, which places tremendous value on planning horizons and institutional continuity, that alignment isn't optional. It's the fundamental requirement for serious engagement. And let's be explicit about what this signifies for the supposed $300 billion catastrophe. That figure isn't arbitrary, and it's not a singular accounting entry. It's an estimate of foregone capital, diminished productivity growth, weaker spillovers, and lost compensation across time. It reflects what transpires when the center of gravity in a significant sector shifts elsewhere. Output falls beneath potential, supply networks thin, innovation decelerates because production and experimentation separate. These are the gradual grinding losses that rarely generate headlines but shape economic trajectories across decades. Some will contend America can compensate with sheer fiscal power, just spend more, offer larger incentives, construct tariff barriers. But that approach misunderstands the challenge. This isn't primarily about incentive magnitude. It's about their credibility. An incentive that might vanish following the subsequent election isn't equivalent to a smaller one embedded in stable policy architecture. A tariff warning that can be reversed or escalated impulsively isn't leverage, it's volatility. Investors discount that aggressively and appropriately. There's also strategic irony here. The stated objective of American industrial strategy has been reducing dependence on fragile global supply networks, but unpredictability pushes partners to construct alternative networks excluding us. Instead of reshoring exposure, we offshore trust. Japan's move toward Canada is precisely that response. It's a hedge against American inconsistency, and hedges, by definition, reduce reliance. Across time, that undermines the very resilience American policymakers claim to pursue. Politically, this generates a feedback mechanism that's difficult to escape. As capital drifts away, frustration intensifies. That frustration gets channeled into more aggressive discourse about commerce and partners. That discourse further erodes trust, pushing more capital away. The cycle reinforces itself. And by the time leaders recognize what's occurring, the narrative has solidified. America is being abandoned. Therefore, America must retaliate. It's a profoundly human reaction, but economically, it's counterproductive. None of this requires radical innovation to remedy. It requires discipline. It requires treating industrial strategy as infrastructure, not performance. Roads aren't reconstructed every election. Power systems aren't activated and deactivated to make statements. Successful nations treat commercial frameworks and environmental commitments identically as long-lived systems that only function if everyone anticipates their persistence. Canada has managed to project that gravity. Japan has observed, And America, for now, is paying the consequence for confusing unpredictability with power. If there's a positive aspect, it's that credibility can be reconstructed. But it requires time and it requires restraint. It signifies fewer impulsive warnings, fewer policy reversals, and a willingness to defend mundane consistency against disruptive theatrics. The automotive sector's future won't be determined by one announcement or one election. It'll be determined by whether America can convince its partners that it's capable of maintaining a plan. Japan's choice should be interpreted as an early alert, not a conclusive judgment. But alerts only matter if someone pays attention. Listening, though, is the difficult component because it requires acknowledging that some damage is self-generated. It requires recognizing that credibility isn't something you can demand. It's something you earn by being predictable when it matters and restrained when it's tempting otherwise. In economic policy, restraint rarely generates applause. It doesn't trend digitally. It doesn't produce the visceral satisfaction of threatening a tariff or dismantling an agreement. But restraint is precisely what convinces partners that you're secure to construct with, not merely exchange with. There's also a deeper misunderstanding in American conversation about what power resembles in a world of intricate supply networks. Power isn't merely the capacity to punish, it's the capacity to coordinate. It's the ability to establish standards, synchronize incentives, and attract private capital in a shared direction. Japan grasps this intuitively. So does Canada. They're not attempting to dominate the automotive future independently. They're attempting to secure relationships that make that future legible and stable. America, conversely, often behaves as if uncertainty itself is leverage, when in reality it primarily just frightens away the very actors we need most. This matters enormously for environmental outcomes too. The transition to electric vehicles isn't merely an industrial shift, it's an environmental imperative. Delays and fragmentation elevate costs, decelerate adoption, and complicate decarbonization. If battery supply networks, charging frameworks, and vehicle platforms splinter across boundaries because trust erodes, everyone pays more and progresses slower. Japan's decision to collaborate more intensively with Canada is partially about insulating its environmental strategy from American political whiplash. That should sting because it implies America is now perceived as a source of environmental exposure rather than environmental leadership. And yet none of this signifies the narrative is concluded. Economic geography is adhesive, but it's not destiny. America still possesses extraordinary assets, deep financial markets, world-class research establishments, experienced automotive workforce, and a massive domestic market. What it lacks is a signal that these assets will be deployed within a stable cooperative framework rather than a constantly shifting battleground. Correcting that doesn't require abandoning industrial strategy. It requires completing the task by making it durable. Durability, however, is a political choice. It signifies building cross-party consensus around core economic commitments. It signifies defending partners publicly instead of using them as contrasts. It signifies accepting that certain policies must outlast individual careers to be effective. Nations that succeed at this don't do it because they're more principled. They do it because they understand the mathematics. Long-range investments demand long-range regulations. Anything else is merely wishful speculation. For the American automotive sector, the stakes couldn't be more elevated. This sector has already experienced one slow-motion collapse driven by offshoring, underinvestment, and policy drift. The electrification epoch was supposed to be the comeback narrative, the moment when lessons were absorbed and mistakes corrected. Japan's pivot toward Canada suggests that from external perspective, those lessons still appear unlearned. That perception, justified or not, has ramifications. So when people question whether this is genuinely a $300 billion challenge, the honest response is that it depends on what we do subsequently. If America treats this as interference, dismisses it, and intensifies unpredictability, the losses will compound. If it treats this as feedback and responds with gravity, consistency, and a renewed commitment to being a dependable partner, the damage can be contained and potentially reversed. Economics isn't fate. It's incentives, expectations, and choices unfolding across time. Japan has made its expectations transparent. Canada has positioned itself accordingly. The question now is whether America is willing to do the unglamorous work of reconstructing trust, or whether it will persist mistaking volatility for strength and be astonished when the future keeps getting constructed elsewhere. if you care about where employment is generated, how the environmental transition unfolds, and whether America remains a serious economic actor rather than a loud yet unreliable one, this is a moment worth observing. Stay engaged, challenge the convenient narratives, and keep advocating for an economics that values credibility as much as confidence. Because in the extended view, credibility is what actually constructs the future,